So, of course, the peacock is the ultimate symbol of pride. And in old emblematic books of the 16th century, there was a famous engraving of a peacock looking at its feet, where the caption said, "Know thyself," but the peacock's feet were ugly. You're not all this kind of showy stuff, look at your feet as well. But of course the peacock in a way is the ultimate production of sexual selection. Sexual selection was Darwin's idea to explain the difference in appearance between males and females. And of course you could barely have a greater difference than you have in peacock. That is that males competed for females and females chose between different males. Now in the peacock's case, we think that wonderful plumage has evolved because females chose to mate with the males with the most elaborate plumage. At a certain point, natural selection kicks in and says, well, although a female might prefer a 4 metre long tail, natural selection says that won't work because you just get eaten by a tiger or whatever. People have done experiments where they've added different numbers of eye spots to peacocks' tails, and females do prefer something even more extreme. So natural selection acts as a brake on sexual selection. Natural selection stops that evolving because the birds just don't survive to breed.
What we're looking at here is a peripheral nerve that has been injured but has attempted to regenerate, or is partially regenerated. So what you can see, the bright yellow filaments are all individual processes coming from the nerve cells within the nerve, and each of these is called an axon. So these run all the way from the central nervous system out to the periphery. So in some cases they can be very, very long. For example, a nerve that supplies your foot might be 1 metre long with its cell body in the base of the spinal cord running all the way out to your foot. So here we see this is the relatively normal part of the nerve here. This will be the side that's closest to the spinal cord, which is an injury has occurred here. And what the fibres have done is they have, in response to that injury, they sprout in an attempt to grow back to the periphery. The bit that's no longer attached to the spinal cord will die off. It has no means of survival. But the bit that's attached to the cell body can stay alive and it can regenerate. But as you can see, what you get is this disordered mass of nerve fibres as they attempt to cross the gap into what's left of the peripheral stump, where some cells do remain, not nerve cells, but glial cells that are supporting cells, which if the axons can cross the gap and get into that stump, then they can be guided back to the peripheral target. This disordered mass can remain for many, many years or even permanently following a nerve injury, and it is a site where abnormal activity is generated in the nerve, so the axons firing spontaneously with no stimulus, and this can lead to the generation of pain, a type of pain known as neuropathic pain, which is a pain that can occur following a nerve injury. Axons are axon is a part of the neuron. So the neuron is a single cell, which consists of the cell body and then a long process, which carries the signal, depending on where the cell is, either to another part of the central nervous system or between the periphery and the central nervous system.
The peahen, she does all the incubating, she does all the child rearing. The male just struts around doing his stuff, and so he doesn't take any of the risks associated with reproduction, really. And then once he's inseminated, he doesn't care anymore and he's off. But she then has to go off into the woods, find a nest site and incubate those eggs and take the young down to the water. And in doing that, she's incredibly vulnerable to predators like foxes and so on. So it pays her to be highly cryptic and camouflaged.
I think the unique feature of the teeth is that the nerves within the teeth, so the ones actually within the dental pulp, that's the soft tissue part in the centre of the tooth where the blood vessels and nerves and other cellular materia are. The only nerve fibres in there are pain nerve fibres. So your skin, for example, is capable of determining a number of different sensations: warmth, vibration, heat, touch, and obviously pain if you have a intense enough stimulus applied to the skin, it feels painful. But the nerves inside your teeth, when you activate those nerves, the only sensation you feel is pain. Because under normal circumstances, those nerves would not be activated. So if you apply a light touch to the surface of your tooth, it doesn't activate the nerve fibres in the teeth. If those nerves are activated, that can only occur if there's a pathological process such as tooth decay going on, where you've got enamel destroyed and some of the dentine possibly destroyed, and there's inflammation in the tooth pulp, or if you've fractured a tooth, for example, and lost some of the hard tissue.
The absolute obsession with earning a large salary is, in my opinion, driven by sexual selection, because wealthy males perceive themselves to be, and often are, more attractive to women. People have been fascinated by the social organisation of primates, mainly because they thought it would shed some light on our own evolution. But in fact, the chimpanzee, gorilla and humans are all rather different. So the chimpanzees have a highly social, very promiscuous society. Most males mate with most females within that group. And so there's a lot of what we call sperm competition, and the best evidence for that is if you look at the testes of a chimpanzee, they are enormous. They're relatively enormous. By contrast, the gorilla lives in a different kind of social organisation where the silverback, the dominant male, keeps every other male at bay. So it's him, a group of females, and maybe a few subordinate males. He doesn't have to compete for fertilisation, so his testes are tiny. A colleague of mine who discovered this in the 1970s was involved in moving some primates from one cage to another. They were anaesthetised because you wouldn't want to mess with a gorilla's testes unless it was anaesthetised. And he said, for the chimpanzee, they're just there. But for the gorilla, you had to forage around a bit to try and find them. Now, humans are a bit of an anomaly when it comes to this, because we tend to think of humans as being monogamous. But that monogamy that we see in the Western world in particular is has probably been imposed upon us by the church to try to avoid undue conflict. But if you look at people that haven't been subjected to Western values, it's a bit more like the chimpanzee or the gorilla.
Your eye converts light into a nerve signal. Your taste buds convert different chemicals. Ears convert vibration and sound waves into action potentials. That's the name of the electrical signal that is activated within these nerve fibres that then travels into the CNS and activates centres in the brain.
Darwin called his book Sexual Selection and the Descent of Man.
There are people who have a congenital insensitivity to pain, and they get in all sorts of problems because we learn from a very young age the sorts of things we can do that don't damage us purely from feeling pain. But these people with this congenital insensitivity don't develop that understanding, and they jump off high walls, they do things, if they're walking along, they don't notice if they've got just a stone in their shoe or something. They don't fare very well because they're unable to have the warning that they're damaging themselves.
Alfred Denny was the first professor of zoology in the university. The university started off as Firth College and then rather quickly became the university in the early 1900s. In those days, people taught a wide range of subjects, but he was mainly teaching zoology, I think, to medical students. And he was said to be a rather small man with a slight stutter, but despite that, students absolutely loved him, and he was said to be the most popular lecturer in the entire university. And he started this collection as a way of supporting medical students because they needed to know about anatomy. And so he acquired most of the stuff that we have here so that students could come in, draw and compare specimens to give them a sense of just how animal bodies were made, were constructed, and how they evolved as well. And over the years, more material was added. some people are kind of often a bit shocked by what we've got in here, so we've got a gorilla skeleton, for example, but all these particular specimens came from collection zoos and so on where the animal died. The museum is organised in an evolutionary way, and this cabinet is the kind of culmination because these are the primates. And this specimen here is a tree shrew. I think they're from Southeast Asia, and these are considered to be the forerunners of the primates. So it was something that looked remarkably like this, that gradually evolved into ultimately gorillas and humans, but probably through a route like this with these rather small primates. So this is a skeleton of a bush baby, and this is one of my favourites. This is called a slender loris.
Pain's such a multi-complex condition that it's not just a physiological, can be influenced by a person's personality and also their environmental conditions. So if a patient is particularly anxious about their pain is more painful than a patient that is quite calm and quite relaxed about their pain. Depression can cause pain, and pain can cause depression. Some patients that have pain are treated with medication that is specifically for depression, and that can alleviate their pain conditions. A phenomenon called catastrophization, where a patient, their perception of pain is exaggerated. If they're expecting their pain to be painful, then it will be painful. A patient that doesn't sleep, pain that you're feeling, again, may be exaggerated or elevated compared to a patient that's had a really restful night's sleep.
A gibbon, you can tell that's a gibbon because it's got extremely long limbs. And next to it is a chimpanzee, and next to that a gorilla and a human skeleton at the end here. And it's kind of arranged in a way that people perceive evolution to have taken place in a kind of natural progression. The reality is evolution didn't really work in that natural progression. These were all kind of independent side branches. But having said that, there's absolutely no doubt that chimpanzees, gorillas and humans are all incredibly closely related.
The homunculus model is a representation of the human body that is scaled to the sensory input. So the homunculus has got very large hands, for example, because your hands are very sensitive. Also, the lips are very large.
The areas that are very densely innervated, like your fingertips and your lips, proportionally much larger areas of your sensory cortex are dedicated to those areas, if you see what I mean. So if you look at the proportion of the cortex that the hand represents the hand, it's much greater than the area that represents the arm, for example. So you get big hands in terms of the area of the cortex.
The portion of nerve endings in your hands is larger than compared to, say, the surface of your thigh. And we can test this by using a test called the 2-point discrimination test. So you have points which are sort of greater distances apart, and we can use this to test the sensitivity of different areas of the body. So where the points are closer together.
When I put my two nails there on my lips, I can feel there's a gap between those 2 points. But when I do that same on my leg, even though or on my arm, say, it feels like I'm just poking my arm in one place, pretty much.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
So, just basically, so the points get closer and closer together, and we assess
when it goes from 2 points to 1 point.
We ask the patient when it goes from 2 points to 1 point, and if you do that on your back or on your leg, it's maybe 5 centimeters, but on your lip or on your fingertips it's millimeters. I'm just wondering if you'd been blind from birth and you'd never actually seen an image of yourself, or a photograph or a reflection in the mirror, or indeed of any other human, how would you perceive the different proportions of your different body regions, and would you perceive them to be more like they appear in the homunculus than and how they are when we see ourselves or other people.
Animals survive simply because they're well adapted to their environment. So I think a naive view of evolution is that there is a kind of inbuilt progression heading towards humanity as the climax of all that, but that's just not the case. The world would still function pretty well, probably even better if there were no humans.
Indeed.
And it isn't, people used to say, if you rerun the video of life, would you end up with Homo sapiens? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Our central nervous system, our brain, and the sort of lower and the higher parts of our brain are bits and pieces that have come together from all the different evolutionary ancestors. We have developed these higher areas in addition, but the other bits are still there. We're omnivores, so we have a set of teeth that are suited to that diet, but we still have teeth in common with carnivores.